Good afternoon, listeners, and welcome to the Scruton podcast. My name is Miklós Berencsi. In today's episode, I have the privilege of talking to Peter Kurti, who is currently a visiting fellow at MCC. He works at the Centre for Independent Studies in Sydney, and his research areas include culture, liberty, and civil society. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Miklós.
My first question is going to be, could you please elaborate a bit more on what your research is about, what you're working on while in Australia, and what you're currently researching here in Budapest?
The work that I'm doing here arises directly out of my work at the Centre for Independent Studies. The Centre is a secular think tank, a policy institute that covers areas like education and economics and tax. In the past, we've looked at health programs, very much with a focus on government policy. My area of research is not concerned with government policy, but in a sense the cultural background, the cultural sediment in which policy is made and in which social discourse is conducted. So I'm concerned with questions about that concern the way in which in Australia we go about living as a society, as a society which comprises people from many religious backgrounds, many ethnic backgrounds. We are a very diverse multicultural society. A lot of migrants have come to Australia. And my work there is concerned with all the sorts of issues that arise in a very diverse society. So freedom of religion, freedom of speech. I'm interested in the ways in which our culture encourages and supports people from a wide range of backgrounds. So that's what I've been doing in Australia. Here, I've been looking more specifically at the idea of an overarching national culture or a common culture. And I've been interested in the way in which in Hungary there is a political conception of Hungary as a conservative nation. Now, I know that according to the census returns in this country, a smaller number of Hungarians actually go to church every Sunday. Nonetheless, there is a very strong sense of Hungary as a culturally Christian country. And I think that the current government and the current Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, make a point of presenting Hungary as a Christian nation. And they don't do so in a confessional sense. They're not talking about people's religious beliefs. They're talking about the overarching culture of the country. So I've been interested in looking at what that means, what it means to talk about Hungary as a Christian country, and to relate that more specifically to the thought of Roger Scruton, who was very interested in these sorts of questions. He did a lot of work in this area and promoted the idea of what he called a common culture. So I've been interested to see whether Scruton's concept of a common culture is the same as Orbán's concept of Hungary as a Christian nation, and to see how that works.
Thank you very much. You recently gave a lecture here at Scruton on the topic of identity politics. You outlined a couple of major themes there. Firstly, you mentioned that identity politics makes demands that can seldom be met. What should we think about here, and what are these demands that you refer to?
Well, identity politics is it's a form of it's not a movement. It's a political and cultural trend that focuses very much on the needs and wants of the individual. So my needs as an individual, your needs as an individual, but not just in terms of our individuality as people, but some aspect of that personality, some aspect of that identity. Now, in Australia, where I live, identity politics presents itself in terms of discussions about race, about sexuality, about gender, and those are very strong and prominent themes in Australian discourse. And my argument is that identity politics actually divides because people are identified as being members of a group, and it's the group that asserts the rights of the individual over against the rights of other people. Now, why I say it makes demands that it can't meet, identity politics makes demands that can't be met, is that in its more aggressive forms of identity, in its more aggressive forms, which we are seeing in Australia, in the United Kingdom, in the United States, proponents, advocates of identity politics don't just want acceptance. They don't just want toleration, because tolerance implies living with things that you don't actually like. You know, the neighbors upstairs making a noise, you tolerate the noise. It doesn't mean to say you approve of it or like it, but you're prepared to live with it. Identity politics is now about much more than tolerance. It's about recognition and affirmation. So not only must I accept and tolerate your identity, I actually have to recognize it and not make any judgment about your identity. And as that gets more deeply entrenched in a society, it makes it much harder for those sorts of demands to be met, because it means that we are required to suspend moral judgment. We can't make judgments about other people's lifestyles or identities. You can't judge me, I can't judge you, we have to be neutral. But that sort of neutrality is actually very, very difficult to sustain, because it means that all forms of social and political discourse in the end up being about nothing, because nobody can make a judgment about anything. So why I say that identity politics makes demands that can't be met is that there is no stopping it. It always wants more. What it achieves is never enough. For example, in the widespread acceptance now in the West of homosexuality, which has been something that's happened and has been a welcome move. I mean, so in Britain, for example, it was long criminalised long ago, but has won social and cultural acceptance, as is the case in Australia. Then there is the move to do more than just tolerate, but to recognise and to affirm. And so in Australia, we've seen debates about same-sex marriage, for example. Now, I'm not saying that any of those things are wrong. I'm just making the point that identity politics always makes more demands. There's always more that it wants, and that those demands increasingly become very difficult for a diverse and varied society to accept.
So it's hard to handle all these...
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And it makes politics very difficult, because different groups, different factions, to use a particular word, are always competing with each other. And the government of the day will always find it difficult to satisfy everyone. Not that government is about satisfying everyone, but in a democratic society and with democratically elected government has to act in the best interests of all citizens and not just some.
Absolutely, yeah. Your second statement was a moral choice is always contingent upon culture. What does this mean in today's cultural environment? What are our moral choices today? Do we even consider morality?
For thinkers like Roger Scruton, morality, questions of morality and questions of culture were very closely related. And Scruton had this conception of the self, the individual, as being socially constructed. That is to say, it doesn't float free of cultural and social influences. Who I am, who you are, will always be shaped by the society, the social influence, the society which we live in, the social influences that come to bear upon us. As such, our conception of what is moral can vary according to the circumstances. And that's not to say that it'll vary from day to day, but it can vary from context to context. So things that are considered, for example, quite normal and acceptable in Hungary might not be acceptable in another country like Australia. I can't give you any example, but I'm just saying that I'm making the point that those differences can emerge. Now, Scruton and conservative thinkers like him would argue that moral choice is very much dependent upon culture. What we consider moral or immoral is going to be determined by who, where, and how we live. For example, in Australia, every state and territory, or certainly every state, has now legalized euthanasia. So in Australia, the culture has accepted the moral rightness of euthanasia. Not to say that everyone accepts it. I don't, for example. I think it's wrong, and I think it's been a mistake. But euthanasia has now come to be morally accepted in a way that I don't think it is yet in Hungary, and may you be preserved from that. So if we ask the question, is euthanasia moral, you, as a Hungarian and an Australian debating this, might take very different points of view. And not just because you have different views about suffering, but you have very different views about the way in which healthcare is extended, or the impact of illness on family ties and community ties. So our moral conception is shaped by who we are, how we are, and where we live. And that's really the point that I was making in those remarks.
Okay. Well, we're still on the topic of morality. Can true Christian principles be represented in public life?
That's a very good question. I don't think that the formation of public policy should ever be left to religious leaders. I don't think we should be ruled by bishops or mullahs or imams, for example. So I think that the business of government needs to be left in the hands of democratically elected politicians. But I think that if a community, if a society is shaped by Christian influences, then Christian positions, Christian moral points of view will come to bear on the formation of public policy. I'll come back to the example of euthanasia. If in a Christian society, not in that cultural sense, not in the confessional sense that I was referring to earlier, in a Christian society, there may well be certain positions, certain points of view about the value of human life, which might say, has to be protected at all costs and must never be taken deliberately. A society that was less informed by Christian principles or Christian values, such as Australia, which was at one time very much so, but it's changed a great deal with the process of secularization. In a society like that, it's not whether we think the question would not be, do we consider it wrong to take life, but are we required to act to relieve an individual from suffering when that individual says they want to be relieved from it. So it comes down to the individual choice, the point I was making earlier. It comes down to that conception of the autonomous individual who can decide for him or herself what they want. So in a sense, I think that in a country that is more, not necessarily overtly Christian, but a country that is informed more strongly by a Christian tradition, those principles will seep into the exercise of government. In other countries, they won't. So can they? Yes. Should they? It depends. But I don't think those principles should ever be enforced in a legislative way by religious leaders.
Okay. You also had a third statement. The human being is a socially constructed entity, but as you said, this is a challenge for conservative thinkers. Why is this?
Well, this is a very interesting puzzle, I think, for conservative thinkers like Roger Scruton. And Scruton was aware of this, as are other thinkers like John Gray. They know this is an issue. And the problem is this, that if we talk about the socially constructed self, coming back to that idea that you're a man living in Hungary, I'm a man living in Australia, we have different influences that are brought to bear upon us, and so they shape our identities and our sense of who we are as individuals in different ways. That could mean that we slide into a relativist position. We slide into relativism. That there is no overarching sense of what is good, what is moral, what is true. And Scruton wanted to hold fast to that idea, that there are overarching norms that prevail whatever the context, whatever the society in which the individual is located. So how do we stop that slide into relativism, which seems to follow from this idea of the socially constructed self? Well, Scruton proposed, and I think this is an important idea, he proposed the idea of a common culture. It's something that binds people together, and that we need to adhere to that common culture that will hold all members of a society, all members of a community together. Because once you start to slide into relativism, it doesn't just become about country, but becomes about society or community or social group. It can vary all the way. And what Scruton wanted to do was to, as it were, put a brake on that. And his proposal was for a common culture. And coming back to the opening of our conversation, this was what I was interested in coming to Hungary. To what extent does Hungary as a Christian nation, that concept of Hungary as a Christian nation, to what extent does that serve as a common culture in that sort of Scrutonian sense? But it's important to note that for Scruton in particular, what needed to back that idea up, that idea of a common culture, was the authority of the state. So Scruton was actually quite committed to the authority of the state. Freedom was important, and individual liberty was important. He was a great proponent of individual liberty, but that must always be expressed, it must always be exercised under the authority of the state. And so what we need, what is paramount in any society, in any community, is authority. Coming back to Hungary, we can see that this conception of Hungary as a Christian nation is expressed and upheld at the highest levels of government, that it's the authority of the state that backs this idea up. And I think that's a very interesting idea, and one that I think makes Hungary a very intriguing example.
Yeah, and you mentioned common culture a lot. But in today's Western individualistic culture, how can we specifically interpret the world of common culture?
Well, that's part of the challenge, I think, that conservative thinkers have. How can we interpret common culture, and what does it mean, and how do we make it take hold, as it were? And I think in a very basic sense, we have to keep arguing for it, and we have to keep demonstrating by argument how important this conception is, and that what is likely to happen if we let go of a common culture. And I feel strongly about this because in the country where I live, in Australia at the moment, the notion of a national culture, a common culture, is deeply questioned. Australia is a young country, settled in 1788. Some would say invaded by the English in 1788. The Commonwealth of Australia was established at the turn of the 20th century. Many people regard that as illegitimate. The role of the place of the monarchy, for example, in Australian society. We're not run by the king in London by any means, but we're a constitutional monarchy with historical and constitutional ties to the United Kingdom. That is questioned. Australia as a settled Western nation is questioned. What is the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians? Even Indigenous people disagree about that. The point I'm making is that in a country like Australia at the moment, for all kinds of reasons, national identity, a common culture, a national culture is something that is really questioned. And it becomes very difficult to assert the idea of what it is to be an Australian. What do we mean by an Australian? Even our national day, the 26th of January, which commemorates the arrival of what was called the First Fleet in 1788, the national day is challenged. And I think we have to keep arguing in Australia for that. Well, conservatives like me have to keep arguing that these things are important because they help to identify us as a society, bind us, and they acknowledge not just what has been achieved, but they acknowledge what it has been important for the countless migrants who have come to Australia from all parts of the world, made a home there, and lived very successfully and peacefully. What I think is really interesting about Hungary, and as I've gone around the country in recent weeks and spoken to students, to young people, is that they have a very strong sense of what it is to be Hungarian. and they're proud of being Hungarian. And I think that the contrast between what Hungary is and what Australia at one time might have been is instructive. And I think it can be a reminder to people in my country that actually national identity is important and that we have to hold fast to that, because if we don't, we will fragment as a society.
You mentioned or described Hungary as a Christian nation a lot. But how do you think Christianity in today's atmosphere can follow social and cultural transformations?
I think it can inform transformation rather than follow transformation. I think the Christianity is always changing and manifests itself in different ways in different parts of the world. Within the Catholic Church, within the Anglican Church, to which I belong, it will manifest itself in different ways. I think that it's important for Christian principles about the individual, for example, about the individual, the moral value of the individual, of individual human life. I think it's important for principles such as those to inform discourse about the way in which society is developing and about the way in which policy is formulated. I don't think necessarily that Christianity should follow. I think that one of the strengths of any religious tradition is that it can serve as a bedrock, as a foundation. Whether it's Judaism or Islam or Christianity, it can serve as a bedrock. Not to say that it doesn't change, but it provides a foundation for society, for the formation of morality and moral points of view. If religion, such as Christianity, follows social change and does nothing more, I think it will weaken. I'm not saying that it should never change or should never respond, but I don't think it's the task of Christian theologians, for example, to catch up with what sociologists are saying about prevailing trends in society. I think they need to inform. Those conversations need to inform each other, but I don't think Christianity should necessarily be following.
So you think the main pillars should remain where they are, and only slight change can be allowed?
To an extent, that's right. Yes, but the change, not that change is wrong, but the change should only occur if it's necessary and contributes to the strength and health and vitality contributes to the strength and health and vitality of a society. For example, I think, take the example of capital punishment. Capital punishment is now not legal anywhere in Australia. And thank goodness for that, it was abolished in the 1960s. I think that if there were to be a move to reintroduce capital punishment in Australia, it would be very important for Christians, for Christian leaders, to make a stand on the value of human life and why, and the nature of punishment as well. Right. And that if it were to be legalized, and suppose hypothetically capital punishment was to be reintroduced in Australia, I don't think it would be appropriate for Christianity to say, oh, well, you know, times change, we'll change our position on capital punishment because that's what everybody wants. I don't think that can be appropriate. So I think that's what I mean in a sense that religion, Christianity can serve as a bedrock, as a break, as a foundation, as a pillar, to use your word, which offers an anchor point, which can hold things, keep things steady. And things do change in society, but I think that the place of religion is not to introduce radical or revolutionary change, but to inform the way in which social change occurs. I should say, of course, that slavery, which is a very contentious issue in many Western nations, and I should say not so much the concern with contemporary slavery, which exists, although there are people who campaign very strongly, and rightly so, about contemporary slavery. A lot of the debate is about historic slavery. Now, Christians were a very strong part of the charge to abolish the slave trade in the 18th and 19th centuries. And that would be an example of where Christianity can take the lead and say, this is not who we are, this is not what we should be doing as a society, things need to change, and for these reasons. So Christianity can take the lead, but I don't think it should be following the lead.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your insights, Peter. And thanks to everyone for listening. Tune in next time. Goodbye.